The first thing I heard was the crack of branches behind me. It wasn't just a twig snapping under a bird's weight. It was deep, deliberate, something massive moving through the trees. My stomach turned to ice. I turned my head, just slightly, and then I saw it. A grizzly, huge, towering, a living wall of muscle and fur. Its eyes locked onto me like I was prey. My breath caught in my throat. It was close, too close. I didn't have time to think, didn't have time to move. But before I could even process what was happening, I heard the snarl. Deep, guttural, ferocious. Roki. He lunged. My German shepherd, my best friend, the dog that had slept at the foot of my bed since he was a pup, launched himself straight at the bear. It was madness. I should have stopped him, but my body was frozen, my brain scrambling to make sense of the horror unfolding in front of me. The grizzly reared up, its massive claws swiping through the air. Roki dodged the first strike, baring his teeth, his body coiled like a spring. He wasn't just barking, he was fighting, and the bear didn't like that. Behind me, my father yelled something, but I barely registered it. My heartbeat was a war drum in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but how could I? Roki was still there, still holding his ground against something 10 times his size. The bear lunged. Roki dodged again, snapping at its leg. The beast roared, the sound shaking my ribs. My father grabbed my arm, yanking me backward, and for a second, I lost sight of Roki. No! I wrenched away, my feet stumbling over roots. The bear's massive paw slammed into the dirt inches from where my dog had been. I barely had time to register that before my father pulled me again, his grip like steel. "We have to go." His voice was sharp, desperate. "Now!" Roki growled, still refusing to back down. My chest ached. Every part of me wanted to stay, to fight. But what could I do against that? My father knew it too. His eyes were wide, terrified. Another snap. This time, the bear's head jerked toward me. It saw me, and suddenly, I wasn't just an observer anymore. I was prey. The ground felt like it was shaking, or maybe it was just my legs. But before the bear could charge, Roki made his move. He went for the bear's throat, and that was the last clear thing I saw before everything turned to chaos. The wind whipped through the open windows of my dad's old truck, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Spring was here, warm enough to melt the last traces of winter, but still crisp in the mornings. Roki had his head out the window, his ears flapping, tongue lolling. He loved car rides. "You excited, bud?" I asked, reaching back to scratch behind his ears. He gave a low woof in response, tail thumping against the seat. Dad chuckled from the driver's seat. "He's got more sense than you do. He knows a weekend in the mountains is better than any damn video game." I smirked. Says the guy who still listens to cassette tapes. Dad scoffed, adjusting his grip on the wheel. "Hey, music was better back then." The road wound higher into the hills, the trees growing denser. I had always loved these trips. Ever since I was a kid, my dad and I would spend weekends in the mountains, camping, fishing, and hiking. It was our thing. And ever since we got Roki, he had been part of it too. "Remember the first time we brought him up here?" Dad asked, his voice nostalgic. I nodded, smiling at the memory. Yeah, he was just a pup. Ran straight into the river trying to catch a fish. Dad laughed. "Dumbest, bravest little thing I'd ever seen. But that's Roki. No fear, no fear." The words sat strangely in my chest. I glanced at Roki. He was still watching the trees blur past, completely at ease. But something in me felt different this time. Maybe it was the way the shadows stretched a little too long between the trees. Or maybe I was just getting older, noticing things I hadn't before. "Do you ever think about what you'd do if we actually ran into a bear out here?" I asked suddenly. Dad gave me a sideways look. "We never have. But what if we did?" He sighed, rubbing his jaw. "You don't run. You don't turn your back. You stand your ground, make yourself big. Most of the time, they're more scared of you than you are of them." Roki let out a low huff, almost like he was listening, like he understood. Dad shook his head. "It's not the bears you should be worried about. It's the stupid decisions people make when they see one. I didn't know why, but his words stuck with me as we climbed higher into the mountains. Something about this trip felt different. I just didn't know why yet. The first sign that something was off came as soon as we set up camp. Roki, usually the first to explore, was tense. His ears pricked forward, his body stiff as he scanned the tree-line. I followed his gaze, but all I saw were trees swaying in the evening breeze. "What's up, bud?" I crouched beside him, rubbing his neck. He didn't relax. Instead, he let out a low, warning growl. Dad looked up from unpacking. "What's wrong with him?" I shrugged. "Not sure. He's acting weird." Dad glanced at the tree line, then back at Roki. "Probably a deer or something. He'll settle." I wanted to believe that, but Roki wasn't the kind of dog to growl at nothing. As the sun set, the forest shifted. The air cooled, and the sounds of birds faded into the distant hoots of owls. We had a small fire going, the light flickering against the trees. Dad was telling a story, something about his younger days hiking these same mountains, but I wasn't listening. Roki was still on edge. Every few minutes, he'd lift his head, ears twitching. Once, he stood suddenly, his body rigid, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the fire's glow. He growled again, deeper this time. "Enough," Dad said, his voice firm. "Lie down, Roki." Roki hesitated but finally obeyed, curling up next to me. I ran my fingers through his fur, but I could still feel the tension in him. That night, I woke up to barking. It wasn't the usual "I heard something" kind of bark. It was furious, relentless. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, heart hammering, and unzipped the tent. The fire had burned down to embers, but I could see Roki at the edge of camp, hackles raised, barking into the darkness. "Roki," I hissed. "What is it?" He ignored me, teeth bared, muscles coiled like he was ready to attack. My stomach twisted. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it where he was looking. Nothing. Just trees. Just night. Dad stirred behind me. "What the hell's going on?" "Something's out there," I whispered. He groaned. "Probably a raccoon. Go back to sleep." But Roki didn't think it was a raccoon. And deep down, I didn't either. Time slowed to a crawl. The grizzly locked eyes with me, its massive body shifting forward. My breath caught. My muscles refused to move. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. Roki could. He lunged with a furious snarl, his body a blur of motion. The bear roared, a deep, guttural sound that made my bones vibrate. It swiped a paw at him, but Roki was too fast, dodging just in time. He snapped at the bear's leg, his teeth sinking into thick fur. The beast bellowed in pain, swinging its massive head toward him. "Roki, no!" My voice cracked. Dad grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "We have to go." But I couldn't leave him. The bear reared onto its hind legs, towering over Roki. My heart slammed against my ribs as it brought one enormous paw down. Roki barely leapt aside in time, dirt exploding where he had been. The bear turned, swiping again. This time its claws grazed Roki's side. He let out a sharp yelp but didn't stop. I grabbed a rock, a stupid, useless rock. My fingers closed around it as if it could do anything against a creature that could crush me in an instant. My hands were shaking, but I hurled it as hard as I could. The rock struck the bear's shoulder. It barely reacted. "Come on!" Dad's voice was sharp with panic, but I was frozen. Roki darted between the bear's legs, snapping at its belly, keeping it distracted. He was buying us time we weren't using. Then the bear turned to me. His massive head swung in my direction, nostrils flaring. A fresh wave of terror gripped me. My legs finally obeyed. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Roki saw it too. He saw where the bear's attention had shifted, and he made a decision. He threw himself at the bear's face. A blur of fur and teeth, he latched onto the side of its massive head, his jaws clamping down. The bear roared, staggering sideways, shaking its head violently. Roki held on. My stomach clenched as the bear flung itself against a tree, trying to dislodge him. "Roki!" My voice was raw, and then, in an instant, the bear succeeded. Roki was thrown to the ground with a sickening thud. Couldn't breathe. The bear loomed over him, and I realized we had to do something. Now, the bear loomed over Roki, its breath heavy, labored. Blood matted its fur where Roki's teeth had torn into it, but it wasn't backing down. If anything, it was angrier. I took a step forward, heart pounding. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused. Roki struggled to get back on his feet, shaking his head as if trying to clear the impact. He was hurt, but he wasn't done. Dad's voice cut through the chaos. "We have to go. Now." He grabbed my arm, but I yanked away. "We can't just leave him." Dad's face was pale, his jaw clenched. "If we stay, we die." The words hit like a punch. I looked back at Roki. He was panting, blood staining his fur where the bear's claws had grazed him. His eyes met mine, and for a second I swore he understood. He knew what was happening. He knew what I had to do. The bear growled, shifting its weight. It was deciding whether we were worth the trouble. Roki made the decision for it. With a burst of energy I didn't know he had left, he lunged again, snapping at the bear's face. The grizzly recoiled, swiping wildly, missing by inches. Roki barked, loud and sharp, forcing the bear's attention back on him. Dad pulled at me again. "This is our chance." No, my throat was tight. He won't survive if we stay." Roki barked again, pushing the bear back a step. He wasn't running. He was giving us time. He was making sure we got out. My vision blurred. My hands curled into fists. My body screamed to fight, to do something. But deep down, I knew. I met Roki's eyes one last time. "I'm sorry." Then I ran. Dad was already ahead of me, crashing through the trees, his breath ragged. I forced my legs to move, sprinting after him, each step ripping me apart inside. Behind us, I heard Roki snarl, heard the bear roar in response. I didn't look back. Couldn't. Branches slapped against my face. My lungs burned. Every fiber of me wanted to turn around, to run back, to do something. But I didn't, because I knew that if I did, we'd all die. So I kept running, leaving Roki behind, hating myself with every step. The sound of my own footsteps felt distant, drowned out by the pounding of my heart. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. Dad was ahead, pushing forward, branches snapping under his weight. Behind us, Roki was still fighting. I heard his growls, sharp and desperate. The bear's roars shook the forest. I couldn't see them anymore, but I could hear it. The chaos, the struggle, the fight for survival. And I wasn't there to help him. Guilt wrapped around my throat, strangling me. Every step forward felt like a betrayal. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to do something, anything. But my body kept moving, driven by fear, by survival, by the cold, cruel reality of the moment. We broke through the tree-line, stumbling onto a narrow dirt path. Dad grabbed my arm, yanking me forward. "Keep going. Don't stop." I wanted to scream. I wanted to shove him away, to tell him we couldn't just leave Roki. But I knew if we went back, we'd die too. And then it happened. Silence. The growling stopped. The roars faded. The forest went quiet, like the air had been sucked from the world. I skidded to a stop, chest heaving. No, 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 no. Dad turned, eyes filled with something I didn't want to see. "No," I choked. "We have to, son." His voice was firm, but there was pain in it. "He's gone." The words hit like a sledgehammer. I shook my head violently. "You don't know that." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Tears burned in my eyes. I wanted to run back to prove him wrong. But the silence told me everything. If Roki was still alive, we'd hear him. If he had won, if he had survived, he'd come back. But there was nothing. Just the wind through the trees, the distant rustling of leaves. I sank to my knees, my breath ragged. Dad rested a hand on my shoulder, but it did nothing to stop the hollow ache spreading through my chest. We had escaped. We were safe. But Roki had given everything for that, and I knew he wasn't coming back. The walk back to civilization felt unreal. My body moved on autopilot, my mind somewhere else. Stuck in the forest, stuck in that last moment before everything went silent. We found a road eventually. A passing truck slowed when they saw us. 2 battered men stumbling out of the woods. The driver, a man in his 40s with tired eyes, asked what had happened. Dad told him about the bear. I stayed silent. He let us in, drove us down the mountain. I barely registered the ride. The truck smelled like old coffee and gasoline. The radio hummed softly, but I didn't hear the words. All I could hear was Roki's bark, his last bark. At some point, we reached town. The sheriff was waiting, a few others too. They asked questions, where it happened, what the bear looked like, if we needed medical help. I answered in nods and shrugs. Dad did most of the talking. Someone said, "That dog saved your lives." I wanted to scream. People kept saying it like it was supposed to help. Like calling Roki a hero would make it hurt less. It didn't. It made it worse. Because heroes are supposed to come home. But Roki wasn't coming home. I kept expecting to hear his paws on the floor, to feel him press his head against my leg, to see him waiting by the door. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him lunging at the bear, saw him getting thrown to the ground. Sleep didn't come that night, or the next. I replayed it all over and over. What if I had stayed? What if I had fought harder? What if I had done something, anything differently? Dad tried to talk to me. I barely responded. He knew. He understood. But that didn't change anything. On the 3rd day, I sat outside, staring at the trees at the edge of town. And then the thought hit me. What if he was still out there? It was stupid, impossible, but I couldn't shake it. I had to go back. I had to know for sure. 2 days later, I couldn't take it anymore. The uncertainty was worse than the grief. Dad tried to stop me. "It's dangerous," he said. "The bear could still be out there." I didn't care. I had to know. I packed light, a flashlight, a knife, a bottle of water. Nothing that would slow me down. When I reached the trailhead, the forest felt different. Not just because of what had happened, but because now I was walking back into it alone. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling leaves, just my footsteps on the damp ground. Then I saw it, the clearing where it had all happened. The dirt was disturbed, claw marks deep in the soil. A few patches of fur, Roki's, the bear's, stuck to the ground. My stomach clenched. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to step closer. Blood, dark stains dried into the earth. I knelt, running my fingers over the dirt. Cold, rough. Then I noticed something else, tracks leading away. My heart pounded. The bear's tracks were obvious, heavy, deep imprints in the soil. But there was something else. Smaller, lighter prints. Paw prints. I shot to my feet, scanning the trees. My pulse thundered in my ears. "Roki!" My voice barely carried in the stillness. Silence. I followed the tracks, my breath coming in shallow bursts. They weren't steady. They weaved, staggered. He was hurt, a broken branch, a few drops of dried blood. The tracks kept going. Then they stopped. I spun around, searching, listening. "Roki!" Nothing. I stood there, staring at the empty forest, my chest tight. He had made it this far. But where was he now? I didn't know how long I stood there before I finally turned back. My legs felt heavy, my mind spinning. Was he alive? Had someone found him? Had he made it somewhere safe? I didn't have an answer, and maybe I never would.